the current administration?
Oh, look, I think the fundamentals of our relationship with the United States are based on immense intelligence capability and shared capability in some areas under the Five Eyes system, huge military interoperability and working together, and we saw that last night over the Red Sea and Yemen. We've got 10,000 American troops based here in the UK, and obviously we are key partners within NATO. So, and the truth is, on many issues we are aligned. But it is true that sometimes we won't entirely agree. And it is also true that there may be differences between political perspectives. But the truth is, you know, whether it is Tony Blair, George Bush, or indeed Starmer, Trump, it doesn't matter who's in the White House or number 10, there are lots of ways in which the UK and the United States have to work together and be aligned. Now, a good opposition, certainly an opposition that is hoping to form a government in a year in which you anticipate an election, is doing everything it can to be close to those who might become the new government. That is why I spent a lot of my period as Shadow Foreign Secretary going to Washington. You know, I'm well known as one of Parliament's Atlanticists, good friends, both Democrats and Republicans. It's why we were with Donald Trump back in September before his election. We spent 3 hours with him. I was with the Prime Minister in Trump Tower, building relations. And I have to say, we have an incredible team, had an incredible team under Karen Pierce as ambassador in Washington, D.C. Wonderful staff doing a very good job to ensure that whoever won the election, the United Kingdom would be close. And I think you saw that manifest in the meeting that Keir Starmer had in the Oval Office in those early weeks into the Trump term. Now, on a range of issues, whether it's security in the Middle East, whether it's the war in Ukraine, we are playing our part, and I'm sure in further questions we'll go into that in detail. What we've said in relation to trade and tariffs is that we are an open economy. We continue to be an open economy and believe in open trade. We are in negotiation with the United States to get an economic agreement, and we're taking nothing off the table as we consider next steps. In fact, we're consulting with business on the effect of tariffs.
Okay, thank you. Just by way of follow-up, the Guardian today is not terribly optimistic that we are in the front rank for a trade deal. What's your perspective on that?
I read the Guardian. They're not always right. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was in DC last week on this subject. The Business Secretary, the Prime Minister's spokesperson on investment was also in the United States. We continue to negotiate with the United States, and we're working hard to get an economic agreement.
Thank you. Baroness Crawley.
Thank you, Chair. It's very good to have you here, Foreign Secretary. You must appreciate having a sit down for an hour and a half without anyone asking you to go anywhere. I'd like to ask you about our unique position as a bridge between the US and the EU. I'm in agreement with you and with the PM that the UK doesn't have to choose to lie with one or the other. But there are pinch points. If we're negotiating with the EU, there will be areas that will make it more difficult to negotiate with the US. How do you see the UK, in the national interest, managing that balancing act into the future with our trade and with our diplomatic relations?
Let me just say that my instinct, as the Prime Minister has said, is that we should not choose and we should not set this up as a binary choice. It's a mistake. And in fact, when UK policy diverges in that way, it usually signals a mistake, the biggest of which in modern times was clearly the Suez crisis, and prior to that, you could argue, whilst the Attlee-Bevin government were important in setting up NATO, and of course in beginning our nuclear deterrent programme, it was a mistake to step out of the coal and steel arrangements that Europe were founding, the beginning, if you like, of the European coming together that we could have shaped had we been there in those early years. So I don't think that the binary choice is helpful. We have to navigate both. Now, clearly, economically, it is self-evident that our biggest trading partner is with Europe combined, and that's why I was absolutely clear. The number one thing that I set as an objective was our EU reset. Right from day one, I set about going to European capitals and engaging. We have a new relationship with Ireland. We've got a new defence agreement with Germany. We will reset Lancaster House with France, and it was very important for me to get to Poland. I'll be there again next week as well. But it's also the case, and obviously on Europe it will culminate in our summit on May the 9th with the European Union, and Ursula von der Leyen will be back again for that. It's also important that we recognise that we have a very important, large trading relationship with the United States, and outside of the European Union, we have an opportunity to sign deals, to forge deals. I hope we're getting close to one with India as well, and that's all in the UK's national interest.
Thank you very much. If I could just follow up with the areas where you see the most positive future, as it were, with trading with the United States. Would it be science and technology, AI? Would it be, obviously there's a security problem, a question over security generally with the United States at the moment, but do you see it more in the science and technology sphere?
Well, if you look at the world's global leading universities, we in the United States dominate. If you look at AI, whilst the United States and China are leaders, we're just under that tier as third. So yes, on tech, there's much that we can do together. And of course, as we navigate our relationship with China particularly, there are security concerns that mean that we must combine our capacity with the United States for mutual benefit. We must win the race on AI, but also on quantum in the years ahead. And so that is the nub of much that we're discussing with the United States at this moment. Where we diverge, agricultural standards, health, I see less room for agreement with the United States. But frankly, if you're in the United States and spending time on the Hill, many congressmen and women have set themselves against trade deals of that scale, and they take years, frankly, to negotiate. So I think in tech, on science, there is much that we can do together.
Thank you very much.
Darren.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. Can I ask about Russia and Ukraine? What's your current assessment of the prospects for a ceasefire and even a peace deal? And the context here is that until last weekend, it felt as if President Trump was rather more critical of Ukrainian demands and requirements than he was of Putin's position. Has there been some sort of shift since that Zelensky-Trump meeting in Rome? Because since then, the president has been quite critical of Putin. So has something fundamental shifted, or are we as we were?
Well, I think that there's no doubt about it. Our Prime Minister, alongside Emmanuel Macron, has done a lot of heavy lifting in the coalition of the willing. I think we saw that in the NATO meeting of foreign ministers, in which Marco Rubio recommitted the United States to NATO, which was very important. We see that in the nations coming together and committing to stepping up in terms of Ukraine security, but also importantly in terms of Europe's security, and statements from Ursula von der Leyen in terms of rearm, their SAFE programme, how they're now going to procure and how they're going to raise their military industrial capacity, hopefully working alongside the United Kingdom, is an indication of that. All of that has happened in a sense because Donald Trump was pretty clear that he wanted to get a deal. Now, I think that we see, and the images coming out of the Basilica at the Pope's funeral, I think were indicative of this, that actually, because of a lot of our effort, and indeed this time last week, I was with the Ukrainians, the Germans, the French, again ensuring that we aligned and got into the right place. That then went into the American system, and that's what Steve Witkoff took to Russia. So all attempts are going in to get a ceasefire, but in the end this is about the terms of the deal. And you still come back to, and I suspect this lies behind your question, you still come back to what is Russia's real intent. And the truth is, 2 weeks ago, Russian ballistic missiles killed 36, wounded 119 civilians in Sumy. The violence continues. There then was this gimmick of an Easter ceasefire. This is not the appearance of a serious country that wants to engage in a ceasefire, but I admire Donald Trump's efforts to try and bring this about. He is still in it to bring about those efforts, but he's also been clear that if this goes on, he is prepared to walk away from this current round of discussions at bringing this war to an end.
Very quick supplementary, if I may. You see a lot of Marco Rubio, have done in recent weeks, I guess. How much visibility do you have of the detail of the US-Russia discussions? Because if you get a deal along, for example, the lines seem to have been leaked, it would involve lifting all the sanctions on Russia, which would require action from us and Europe as well as from the United States. So do you feel you're getting full visibility of where the US are going in these negotiations?
Well, thank you for noticing that I'm spending a lot of time with Marco Rubio. They've been in office, I think, it's about 13 weeks, just over, and I look back over the records, and I've either seen or spoken to Marco Rubio 13 times. So it's pretty much week to week. We're either in each other's company or speaking to each other. And this week, I think I've spoken to him twice. So we are well cited, not just on foreign minister's track, but it's also the case that the Prime Minister is speaking to the President almost as regularly as I've just indicated. And of course, Jonathan Powell, as our NSA, is also speaking to Mike Waltz, and then all of us are speaking to Steve Witkoff as he shuttles around the world. So we are pretty well sighted, and you will know we've got capability to understand in lots of ways also what others are saying about what kind of deal we might land, and we listen carefully to what Putin himself says about the kind of deal he wants. And at the moment, if you look carefully at his language, it's a maximalist offer, largely the same that it was at the outbreak of this war.
Thank you. Lord Horton.
Foreign Secretary, thank you also for giving your time up this afternoon. Nick Horton, I'm the ex-Chief of Defence Staff on the committee. And can I ask therefore a defence-related question? And it's about the interplay between foreign policy priorities and the decisions on military capabilities and defence funding levels which emerged from the ongoing SDR. The Strategic Defence Review, nearly a year ago now since it kicked off, really started out as an exercise in reassessing defence capability choices in the context of a more dangerous Russia and the need both to support Ukraine and re-establish credible deterrence in Europe, all within a defined financial envelope. In the meantime, however, the global security situation has become much more febrile, and specifically the guarantees of US security to Europe have now become much less certain, even though in a potentially only a partial way, not a comprehensive way. How, therefore, within government are foreign policy priorities now going to play into the Defence Review's capability choices? Because there's some very hard decisions there to be made.
Well, look, I think the important thing to recognise, even before you get to the Strategic Defence Review, is frankly just what a dire state we were in. Our armed services hollowed back to the smallest number since the Napoleonic War. A former Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary sort of saying in hubris that the era of tank battles in Europe was over, a chronic housing problem in our armed forces, and a strategic plan that was absent effectively. Now, what we've done is rapidly increase money to the armed services in the autumn budget, 2.9 billion, in the spring statement, 2.2 billion. That's over 5 billion just in the 10 months that we've been in office, and make that pledge to get to 2.5 by 2027 and to 3% in the next cycle. We've also signed a historic Trinity House agreement with Germany, which I think is important given their Zeitenwende and their complete turnaround, 180 degrees posture in relation to European defence. Now, your question interrogates the posture, if you like, of our closest ally, the United States. Strategically, it's been self-evident, I would say, for at least since the Obama administration, the posture towards the Indo-Pacific. And that, in the end, drives much of the United States calculus, and I think that is a reasonable calculus that Europeans have to take seriously. When Donald Trump came into office, just 4 nations in Europe were meeting the 2% spend on defence in terms of their NATO obligations. Today it's 24. Now the truth is, presidents since Roosevelt have been saying you've got to spend more on defence, Europe. That is now beginning to happen. The penny has landed. So as we head to the Strategic Defence Review, the Defence Secretary, the Prime Minister and I have been clear that it is NATO first. We take our global obligations seriously, of course. We have got to be equipped in the right way for the 21st century. We do that alongside particularly our European and NATO allies, and there's got to be complementarity across those family of allies. But this is an era where we have to spend more. We have to procure better against this backdrop. And we have to be seen to meet our obligations and step up to those obligations. And I think you've seen that with Keir Starmer. And I think it was encapsulated really very well after the falling out we saw between President Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office. Where did Zelensky come? What was the first phone call from the Prime Minister? Where did he come on that Saturday morning? There was a sense that the United Kingdom was back playing that important role.
I absolutely applaud what the government has done thus far. And there is undoubtedly the uplift promised in defence funding. But given the remarkable low base from which we are starting, which is 2%, out of which comes a significant amount on the nuclear deterrent, a significant amount on pensions, you may be aware, what you inherited was our performance as the 32nd of 32 countries in NATO in meeting our NATO military targets, so we were bottom of the league. The indications on uplift that have been made in the context of the almost certainty that Trump will come to the June summit of NATO, demanding of European NATO that it takes on the burden of conventional deterrence in Europe. I get the feeling we're spectating a slow-moving car crash between a government thinks it's doing enough and doing all the right things, but a significant delta between what Trump will lay, not just on us, but on the whole of Europe. And do you think that the government is ready for that, or do you think that it is comfortable with what it's achieved and what it's promised so far?
I understand the inference of the question and why you ask it in the manner in which you do. But given the engagement I've just set out with Marco Rubio, given the Defence Secretary's engagement with Pete Hegseth, given the Prime Minister's engagement with Donald Trump, we'd have to be blind and deaf to what is clearly the US posture, particularly in relation to the Indo-Pacific. So, and my sense is that the penny has landed, the penny has dropped in Europe. Now, again, at the heart of what you're saying, I think are three potential ideas. One is burden shifting, and the United States shifting the load. The other is a recalibration of burden sharing across the NATO family, and the other is burden dumping. I think that you sound as if you think that the United States is washing its hands and handing it over. What I heard from Secretary of State Rubio was, and I think all of us did in NATO, was something quite different. They are still committed to NATO. And let's be clear, in relation to Ukraine, Starlink, intelligence sharing and capability, the money that was signed off under Joe Biden, which goes right into the autumn, all still there. But they are making demands on sharing and shifting. And I think they're reasonable demands that actually other US presidents have all had. This president has a particular style, but actually Europe is paying attention.
All the dice.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. Foreign Secretary, we have a world that is changing quite radically and unpredictably. And one change is that even during the depth of the Cold War, there were diplomatic and political and professional and scientific exchanges and meetings going on. Even our nuclear physicists from the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom, France, were meeting with each other through Pugwash and the American Academy of Sciences and the Russian Academy of Sciences. All of that stopped with the Russia-Ukraine war. In a context where the US administration is now engaging directly with the Russian leadership, what channels of communication and dialogue are there, if any, between the British government and the Russian leadership? Are there any things that you can tell us about that, other than that we have an ambassador of the Security Council who obviously engages from time to time with his Russian opposite number?
We have you'll be pleased to know we've also got an ambassador in Russia who's able to engage with the Russian system. And there are channels on which there is engagement. There's not been, since Liz Truss made her unsuccessful visit to Moscow, engagement at my level. That is true. And against a backdrop of our support to Ukraine, I've not deemed that necessary. But what I would say is, what I have sought to do since I've come into the department is distinguish between Ukraine policy and a broader Russia policy. And therefore there's a lot of work going on in the department in relation to Russia per se. I do believe, I've got to be clear, that my assessment is that Russia does pose a systemic threat to much of our national interest and much of Europe's national interests. But if you're in the business of diplomacy, you've got to be in the business of engagement on a range of issues, but one's got to be clear where those are best placed, and at the moment it's not at my level.
Apart from your own level, you've said that Russia is a clear and present danger. That was the case during the Cold War as well. But at that time there were meetings of scientists and academics and professional organisations, which there have not been for quite some time now. Is this a time when those kinds of things can begin to be explored? Or if it's not, what might be the indications that there was a time to do that kind of thing?
Well, it was a Cold War. And unfortunately, Vladimir Putin has set himself on a path that is demonstrably a hot war in Europe, with people dying in their thousands on a weekly basis as we speak. He set himself on a path where our own people have lost their lives following the Salisbury poisoning on our own soil. And where there are attempts, hybrid war, sabotage to our system on a pretty regular basis. This doesn't feel very cold, it feels pretty hot. And it's against that background that one makes an assessment. But what I do want to say very, very clearly is the Russian people, the contribution of Russia over centuries is immense, and one can have huge respect for Russian art, Russian literature, Russian music, what the Russian people have produced in so many ways, and indeed for the people of Russia. And it's always important to distinguish between Putin and the regime currently running Russia, and of course the Russian people themselves. And if your question goes to that, then I'm with you, and that's why you're absolutely right. We must distinguish a Russia policy and wider posture, and that is constantly under review in the department from, of course, Ukraine policy, notwithstanding our closeness and proximity to the Ukrainian fight.
Thank you very much.
Ernest Baxter.
I'm going to turn to the Middle East. Given that Israel has fully blocked the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza now for over 50 days and continued to target the civilian infrastructure, can you tell the committee what steps the UK government is taking to prevent further humanitarian suffering being inflicted on the civilian population in Gaza?
Well, let me be crystal clear. The blockade that Israel is undertaking now of necessary aid into Gaza is horrendous. The suffering is dire. The need is huge. The loss of life is extreme. And we have been absolutely clear, and just last week with as an E3 alongside France and Germany, we were very clear in our statement condemning the blockade that exists at this time and the need that we see in Gaza. And you know, I've been very clear, and I was clear just a few weeks ago in person to the Israeli foreign minister about their obligations, and to Minister Ron Dermer, their Minister for Strategic Affairs. I was in Qatar and Oman at the weekend, and of course had extensive discussions with them about the current situation. Of course, the Qataris have played an immense role getting us to a place where we got that first ceasefire. We want to get back to a ceasefire, and so there's a lot of diplomacy to get us back to that ceasefire, and of course to deal with the issue of how do you deal with Hamas. So I think, I would imagine all of this committee accept there are legitimate concerns for the Israelis in terms of their security going forward. Now, it's my belief that that will not be solved militarily. In fact, if it would be solved militarily, you might have seen that happen in the since October the 7th. It's now gone on for some time, and it hasn't happened. We saw when those hostages come out, those men with masks and Kalashnikovs, Hamas was still there. So how do you deal with Hamas? Well, what I was talking to the Qataris about, what we talked to the Israelis about, is this takes an exit for the Hamas leadership that's still in place, probably to a third country. This takes a proper demilitarized position for Hamas in the system, similar to what we undertook in Northern Ireland. The arms have got to be laid down, and it takes a zero-tolerance approach to the governance of Hamas. That's why I signed a memorandum of understanding just yesterday with Prime Minister Mustafa of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority in their reform, because we believe, if you believe in two states, there has to be a place for the Palestinian Authority. They need reform, but we continue to support them.
Thank you. I've just seen the letter you wrote yesterday to the chairman of this committee, and I think many people will welcome your outrage and feel the same level of indignation about what's happening. But I want to just quote one line back to you, if I may. In it you say, "The Israeli decision to block aid supplies and power in this way is intolerable and risks breaching international humanitarian law. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool." Why risks? It is breaking humanitarian law, surely. And I think many people who read this letter and hear what you're saying would agree with it all, but they'd want to know a bit more about what action you're taking. And action has to be more than criticising the Israeli government. We've been doing that for a long time. It doesn't lead to any changes.
I have taken action. action. The first day I was in office, I instigated a review on our arms sales to Israel, and with regret I announced in Parliament back last September that we would not be continuing to supply arms that Israel can use in Gaza, because I believed, on the basis of our export licensing regime that was set up actually or revised under the last government, that there was a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law. That's the criteria I used against that sober assessment that was made. At that time, the last government, and the last time I saw that Lord Cameron was before this committee, the committee pressed him on restoring funding to UNRWA. I restored funding to UNRWA. There were concerns about just how much aid and commitment we were giving to Gaza. I increased our spend in Gaza, notwithstanding the issues about the aid actually getting in. So I have acted. I've now been to Israel, I think, 3 times in this last period. There's been a lot of engagement, of course, with Arab partners. I support the Arab plan. We want to improve it, particularly in relation to Israel's security and Hamas, and that was why I was in Qatar at the weekend. So a lot of diplomacy, a lot of engagement, a lot of working with partners. That means also working with the United States and Steve Witkoff in particular. Let's get that ceasefire back on track. And of course, also understanding the malign behaviour that sits behind a lot of the problems in the Middle East, and that's Iran, which is another subject that we could talk about, and a lot of engagement too on that file.
Thank you. One just very quick further question, if I may. On the subject of breaking international humanitarian law, what position is the government currently taking on the judgments of the international courts on this matter?
Well, it is a judgment for international courts, but we have been crystal clear in our own commitment to international humanitarian law and our own commitment to the architecture that was set up, much of it in the wake of the Second World War, in which so many men and women across Europe and our own country sacrificed and gave so much, an architecture that was set up by pioneers within our own country. This used to be a cross-party position. People like Winston Churchill did a hell of a lot to give us our current human rights architecture across Europe. So we continue to support that. We continue to support organisations like the ICC and the ICJ, although I recognise that that is now politically contested by some.
Welcome, Foreign Secretary. I just want to put it to you that occupants of your high office for, my guess is at least 30 years, of whichever party, have used pretty much the same mantra in respect of Israel, Palestine and a two-state solution. In fact, the wording, I haven't quite got it off by heart, but is in your most recent letter, the solution is grounded in a two-state solution that will guarantee security and stability for Israel alongside a sovereign and stable Palestinian state. I can't think of a foreign secretary that wouldn't have said that. But it sounds increasingly to me like motherhood and apple pie in terms of it being desirable and wonderful were it achieved, but there seems to be very little prospect of it being achieved, not least because Netanyahu has now spelt out beyond any doubt for anyone who was in any doubt that he hasn't the slightest intention of agreeing to a two-state solution. So I really want to put it to you, does this foreign policy objective, consistent over so long, any longer have any possibility
of realistically being a solution?
Well, let's step back first of all and let me be frank about the kind of person I am. I've been in public life now 25 years, and I suppose it's possible to get to this level in public life and find yourself in cynical indisposition. But I retain the optimism that I arrived in Parliament with. It's an optimism that said, when some said, I'm sorry, apartheid is here to stay, and others said no, it changed. Some said the Cold War is here to stay. Those fought against it. I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. So there will always be moments when we look back in history when the impossible did not seem possible. But the whole point of diplomatic endeavour is to persevere, and you are failing every day until you succeed. And the best modern example of that here in the United Kingdom is the I remember those bombs exploding that killed so many lives because of the problems and the troubles in Northern Ireland, and in the end, with cross-party consensus and a lot of hard work, we got there. So we can get there too on a two-state solution. And what are the ingredients and how do we get there on a two-state solution? Well, again, let's give the current President of the United States some credit for the Abraham Accords, and let's continue to press hard to get to Saudi-Israel normalization. And on any analysis, it's hard to see how you achieve that prize of normalization without two states. Let's focus on what we can do to give Israel the assurance that it needs in relation to Hamas. Let us continue to bear down on Iran's nuclear ambitions, which would be devastating for the Middle East, and let's continue to support those within the occupied territories who still believe in, obviously, a home of their own. And I've always said the Palestinian cause is a just cause, but want to live alongside Israel. That means you must continue to support the Palestinian Authority. And as I say, I signed a memorandum of understanding with Prime Minister Mustafa this week. All of that gives me hope. If you don't believe in two states, then you either believe in one state, in which you have to then, the Israelis would have to explain how Palestinians are able to live with equal rights, and I think that that's problematic at the moment, given the occupation, or you believe in no state. Well, I'm afraid it's unacceptable for any group of people to have lived without no state for longer than I have been alive. So for all of those reasons, the only option is two states, and we will continue to work with partners at the moment, particularly with France, as we head towards their conference in New York on two states, alongside the Saudi Arabians, to work with those two partners to ensure that we keep alive two states.
Surely a prerequisite for a two-state solution is to acknowledge that two states have got to be recognised, and that brings me really to that quite specific question, that it is within our the Labour Party's manifesto to recognise the state of Palestine. It is something that the United Kingdom could do. It's something which 160 odd states across the world have already done, and it's something which Western European states, including Spain and Ireland and Norway, have already done. Isn't that some quite specific decision within the power of the British government, if necessary without reference to anyone else, but obviously preferably in collusion with other people, that would make a positive step that would say to the Palestinians, your position is not hopeless, which, as you've rightly described, has sometimes appeared a bit like that. during our lifetime. When is that likely to be achieved? Because, of course, if we wait until Israel says, yes, we agree with that, then it's simply not going to be achieved, certainly not during the course of the life of this government.
Well, I understand why you raise that, Lord Grocott, and let me be clear. No one has a veto on when the United Kingdom recognises that Palestinian state. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I recognise that there are some who see this as symbolic, and there are countries in Europe that have taken this step recently. But on another set of questions I got from the committee, whilst it was a symbolic act, you've got to ask yourself, did it change much on the ground? And the sad conclusion is, it didn't. And so we have always said that recognition is not the end in of itself. Two states is the end in of itself. And we would prefer recognition as part of the process to that two states. And so we will continue to talk to partners about that. President Macron has had a lot to say about that most recently, alongside the Saudis, and of course we are in discussion with them at this time, and we take and this is a solemn undertaking, as members of the UN Security Council, we take, and Britain has always played that role, to contribute to progress on the ground, not just a symbolic act. And that's the detail and the granularity of the diplomacy and our engagement at this point in time. But I should say to you, because this is important, settlement expansion at the moment is undermining the viability of two states, and settler violence levels are shocking. In the last year, we've had 59 illegal outposts on the West Bank. In 2024, the average was there were 59 established in 2024. The average was 7 over the last 25 years. So that is all undermining the prospects of two states. And it's why I announced sanctions on some of that settler behaviour a few months ago.
Thank you. Which takes us to Lord Sainsbury's question.
Thank you, Jim. Foreign Secretary, I must congratulate you on retaining your optimism after all that time in Parliament. Mine gradually diminished after my first Parliament, I have to tell you.
Well, you were always very nice to me when you were in the House.
We've asked these questions. I don't want to repeat myself endlessly, but we're now at nearly 300 illegal settlements. Everyone is illegal. Everyone is an obstacle to peace and an obstacle to a two-state solution, or whatever way it should turn out. And I just wanted to ask you, even though you've been very clear in what you said, but what further steps do you believe that the British government can take to prevent Israel from building further settlements, which are absolutely illegal under international law? And what are the implications of Israel's settlement activities for the stability of a two-state solution? Well, I think you've dealt with that. But just the first bit, I very much agree with Lady Blackstone that every foreign secretary, because of the way it is, has always been, Lord Greycock has always been in the same position on this, and you have been robust, and I'm glad that our foreign secretary is robust. But this these settlements are actually making it impossible for there ever to be a two-state solution, because there isn't any room for a second state.
Well, I think you're right, drawing on so many years of experience in foreign policy, to place great emphasis, like Lord Grocott has, on this area of behaviour, because of the rapid acceleration we've seen in this last period of time under the current government in Israel. And it's undermining the progress that was made in Oslo. It's undermining the 1967 arrangements, and it's running a coast and horses over that just cause. And I emphasise this every time I engage with my counterpart in Israel. It was a subject of discussion at the G7 in Canada a few months ago. Of course, it's always a subject of discussion with the Quint of Arab states, and it will be central to our discussion in New York alongside France and Saudi Arabia, no doubt about it. And it's why I announced some sanctions, and of course that is kept under close review, as you would expect, because we have a solemn obligation which begun with Balfour, and we are very, very serious about that obligation, and we must live up to it. But I indicated before that I'm an optimist. There have been moments of tension and fear, no doubt about it. October the 7th was a grim and horrific moment. And let us remember that there are hostages who are still not with their families at this time. But even against that backdrop, we there was progress in the Middle East after terrible wars in the past. Let us seize this moment to get progress, notwithstanding how grim it is at this time.
Thank you very much.
Well, Darren.
Foreign Secretary, we could just move the focus to the east a bit from the Middle East. What's your assessment of the escalating tension between India and Pakistan in the wake of last week's appalling and deadly attacks on tourists in Kashmir? And the context here, as you know better than I do, is reports, rumours that the Indians are under pressure to contemplate some sort of military response to those attacks.
Well, let me be clear that the terrorist attack in Indian-administered Kashmir, the Pahalgam area, was horrific. And as you would expect, the UK condemns that terrorism and extremist behaviour. And when I spoke to Foreign Minister Jaisankar a few days ago, and he outlined what had happened to these tourists, stripped, shot in the head, it's been devastating, of course, to the public in India particularly. So we send them our deepest condolences. It was also important, of course, to speak to Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Dar. And I recognise that this is a very sensitive situation, and there are real risks, very real risks to regional and wider stability at this time. And we should remember there have been, I think, 3 wars between India and Pakistan since the independence of those countries. We're keeping our travel advice under constant review. We've already issued factual updates about the closure of the Wagai border. British nationals should be aware at this time of the geopolitical tensions, and I'm deeply concerned about the impact of any escalation would have in the region and those living and working or travelling there. We estimate at the moment that there are over 1 million British nationals, 1 million British nationals and dependents across India and Pakistan. So, of course, I'll be reviewing our plans with ministerial colleagues in the coming days. But I want to say that this is a very different situation to evacuations in other crises in recent history. The challenge of a significant escalation would be of a different order, and that is why, because we are talking in the end about 2 nuclear powers, that all efforts on diplomacy are going in. It's why I spoke to my counterparts. It's why our NSA has spoken to his, of course. It's why we're urging de-escalation and cool and calm heads, notwithstanding the tensions at this time. And of course, I spoke to Secretary of State Rubio about this a short while ago as well.
Thank you. Ernest Fraser.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, given your recent visit to Beijing, could you tell us what surprised you, or perhaps what disappointed you? What is your assessment of the UK's relationship with the People's Republic of China, and how do you think the Chinese leadership view the UK, and what are the government's priorities for UK-Chinese relations?
Well, look, thank you for the question, and let me just give the context, I think, because I think it's important. We have come out of a period of inconsistency, vast inconsistency between the golden era of David Cameron and drinking a beer with President Xi and the Liz Truss approach to China, and the disengagement, the complete disengagement. So when I went to Beijing, I was going after 6 years of disengagement of activity, really, from China. And so I've been really clear. I was clear in opposition, clear in office. There are areas where we cooperate with China, and we must cooperate with China. Things like climate, global health, very, very important areas. We can trade with China as well. The United States has managed to increase its trade with China. This is prior to the tariffs. Increased its trade with China whilst being really tough on issues of security. So there are areas where, of course, we'll compete and where we'll challenge. And when I was in China on Jimmy Lai, on the situation in Hong Kong, on the sanctions against British parliamentarians, these are areas where we will continue our human rights concerns in Xinjiang. We will continue to challenge China most definitely. We're doing a complete audit of our relations with China. We've got a national security review underway that will also publish shortly. So we're clear-eyed about our relationship, but I think it has been important that I have been, my counterpart has come from China, that the Prime Minister has indicated that he will go to China, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been there, that the Net Zero Secretary has also gone, because in the end, this is a global power, that it's hugely important that Britain has a relationship, is engaged with, able to disagree, and sometimes pretty vociferously, but also able to act in our country's national interest as well.
Thank you. You mentioned that you're undertaking an audit. This committee produced a report on China in 2021, before my time. It criticised, as you have alluded to, the then government's approach to China, and it called for that the government needed a clear, unified strategy. So has this changed, and if so, how? And as a subset of that, the report also identified was a deficiency in China-related knowledge and expertise within UK government and civil service. Has this been addressed since 2021, or do you feel that this is still could be the case?
Well, the China audit, I think, will address that issue. And I have been very clear, and I've said this to the new Perm Sec, who's just alongside me, that capability in the department's really important. That's actually both in terms of our embassy in China. I've lost count with the amount of embassies I've visited since becoming Foreign Secretary. I've travelled so much over this last period, but I don't think I found an embassy in worse condition than our embassy currently in China. And I've been really clear that in terms of capability, Mandarin speaking, and the next generation of capability of diplomats, that in this change cycle that we're in, and the 2030 ambition that that the Perm Sec can say a bit more about, we do have to ensure that we have that capability across the range, and Mandarin speaking is a fundamental part of that.
And finally, because I've just got a little bit of time, China's Belt and Road Initiative has become the central instrument of Beijing's global influence strategy. As Western commitments to aid decline, particularly with our own cuts to budgets and to the US AID program, how can we ensure that China's not just stepping into the breach?
Well, I think that is a topic of concern. And it's why I have been clear that here in the United Kingdom, we have not made an ideological decision to abandon our development commitments. Even after the changes that we have made, we will still be the 6th biggest development power and spender, and that's hugely important, one. And two, actually in the calibration that we've made, and I see it a bit like an accordion, if you look over the last 50 or 60 years of the UK, if at one end of the accordion you have hard power, then you get to diplomacy and our diplomatic footprint across the world and our work in the multilateral system as well as the bilaterally. Then you get to soft power, which includes, of course, development, but also fantastic organisations like the British Council, the BBC World Service. Actually, that's always gone up and down across different eras. And sometimes investing in hard power saves lives. By the way, the war in Ukraine has cost the continent of Africa, some estimates 7 billion, upwards 9. And so us investing in hard power at this time is important for global security and saves lives not just in our own country. But against that backdrop, if you abandon development entirely, then others will step into the mix. And that's why it's important that we are still a force in the world on development, and we will be, even after the adjustments that we've had to make.
Bruce.
Baroness Fraser slightly preempted my question, which is about soft power. and I need to declare an interest, as I've been an advisor to DAI, who deliver development programs for both USAID and the UK government. But soft power delivered through official development assistance, the British Council, the World Service, arguably is more required at a time of convulsion, and yet we are rowing back from it, in spite of what you've just said. So can I ask you some specific questions about those particular agencies? So will the government release the British Council from its pandemic ban commercial loan, which is causing it real financial difficulties, and which we've actually written to you about? It's a commercial loan, and it's compromising the British Council, who told us when they came here they were 30 days from being insolvent. Will you commit more long-term support to the BBC World Service rather than having it funded by hard-pressed licence payers? And will you have a look at the impact of particularly next year's cuts in ODA, not least given the amount that is being diverted for domestic refugees and asylum seekers? We are cutting aid, Foreign Secretary, more than France, more than Germany. The EU is maintaining it. Japan is increasing it. So, frankly, isn't the government really weighing back? The rhetoric's great. The actual delivery is cuts, 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 and undermining of what we used to be really, really proud world leaders in.
Well, that was quite a list. So let me just have a sip of water and address that list. First thing is, I actually increased funding to the BBC World Service. In the one-year settlement, I got them an uplift. I think it was £32 million. They've been able to increase. I think they've just brought in BBC Burma, really important. And I was, I do recognise that when you've got Russia Today and others investing in soft power, the BBC World Service plays a very important role. The second thing I did for the British Council was they were given a loan by the last government on commercial terms, and I agreed an 18-month extension so that they could come up with a business plan, get back to paying down that loan, and we could get them into better health. I've seen incredible work from the British Council in India, in Nigeria. Whilst I've been in this role, I've been a huge fan of the British Council over many, many years. My wife's an artist who has done work with the British Council in the past, so I'm well aware of the contribution that they make. And so that is why I got them the extension. Now, as I said, in terms of the decisions that we've had to make in terms of ODA spend, we will still be the 6th most important development player in the world, and we have not made an ideological decision to abandon aid entirely. That has not been our approach. It is true that when you look across Europe, whether it's the Netherlands, whether it's Germany, France, that we are seeing a reduction in spend. But it is also true that there has been a need for a deeper and more meaningful conversation about Western development for many, many years. I make a distinction between humanitarian aid, but we now see the UN agencies with their UN 80 program having to reform as a result of decisions made by USAID. All of us have been in developing countries. All of us have seen the jeeps. All of us have seen the different UN logos. And some of us have wondered why it took 19 different UN agencies in some countries, sometimes duplicating effort. I'm really pleased the UN is doing that work now. China's Belt and Road is a fact. The commitment of the Gulf now to development is a fact. The commitment of India, of Brazil, of Turkey to development is a fact. So the truth is that the architecture that was set up 60 years ago has needed review for some time. Our review is committed to ensuring that in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, we meet our obligations. We continue to support fantastic organisations like BII, which do an incredible job. We will still be there on climate, and we will still try and support the poorest and the most fragile states, which is why I made my commitment to Sudan. But the truth is, we do have to recognise that a conversation about reform is long overdue. I think, too, I want to have a conference that brings together the Western community on development and aid and how we spend that aid, because the time is now right for leadership, and it's also right for being sharper and smarter about the way we spend our money across the board.
I'll just make one suggestion. I mean, reform would be better before the cuts rather than after the cuts. But the second point is, what about a cross-UK approach, bringing trade, investment, diplomacy, culture, all of these things together as a single offer? I've had ambassadors and high commissioners say actually the British offer across Africa and the Commonwealth is a bit complicated and confused. So is that a suggestion that we could do to ensure that our visibility is not dropping below the radar, which a lot of people in Africa say it has?
Your instinct that reform is better before the cuts is probably fair. It's why I announced the Soft Power Council, and it's why I announced the Africa approach. All of that came before the decisions that we had to make on development spend. But what I was sort of suggesting is that it's not just about the UK acting unilaterally, it's about a family of nations committed to development. And I think there's got to be a wider conversation alongside UN agency, and it's that leadership position that I hope the UK can take up in the coming months as we make decisions. But I want to be crystal clear that there is still a commitment to development. We still want to get back to more spend, by the way, when we get back to growth. And I'm absolutely clear that investing in hard power also saves lives and is also important to global security.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, sticking with the theme of the World Service, in your recent visit to the Western Balkans, you warned of the, and I quote, the long hand of Russian interference in the region. One of the recommendations in one of this committee's earlier reports following an inquiry into the Western Balkans was that the government should provide funding directly for the creation of a BBC Albanian service. Nothing, of course, inherently to do with either Albania or Albanian, but in order to counter Russian disinformation in Kosovo, where the majority of the population are Albanian speakers. And as we've seen what a success BBC Serbia has been, would you not agree now that it would be a sensible, self-interested move to create or to provide the funding for a BBC Albanian service? And perhaps I could tack on a quick related question to that main question and ask you if you could clarify whether the future model for sustainable funding for the World Service is expected to emerge from the spending review or from the Charter review, because I've heard both versions from different ministers.
Well, on the first question, thank you for raising the Western Balkans. Thank you for raising Kosovo and this committee's work in the past. I went to Kosovo when I was Shadow Foreign Minister, and I was hugely proud to go. And I came back from that visit concerned that the UK leadership role that begun under Tony Blair was a little diminished following our exit from the European Union and the slightly more isolation, or the looking inwards that followed that decision. It's why this year the Prime Minister and I will be hosting the Berlin process, and I'm really pleased that that we will be leading on that once more. It's why also I was very proud to appoint, one of the most senior diplomats in our our system, Dame Karen Pierce, to be envoy, and she's back in the region, already creating waves as is needed. And I'm hugely concerned at the moment about Russian disinformation and influence. I'm very worried about what's happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Republic of Srpska. It's really very, very challenging and worrying indeed, and it's why we have to be present. Your question about the BBC World Service is well put and well made. These have to be matters for the BBC, not for the government. But what I will do is I will write to the BBC and indicate to them that I am sympathetic to the position that this committee has put, but it must be properly a matter for them. Of course, the overall settlement will be determined by the spending review, but the Charter review is vital and fundamental in this regard, because in the end, the BBC derives much of its funding from that Charter review, and that necessarily affects the BBC World Service as well. And so both, I think, are pertinent to the subject at hand.
Thank you.
Well, Bruce.
Just very quickly, can I ask you a question about Sudan? Obviously, you hosted the London conference, which was perhaps predictably inconclusive given the difficulty. Do you see what the next steps could be, given that there are agencies outside that are turning it into a proxy war? What can the UK do with partners to promote the opportunity for actual internal negotiation involving citizens, involving women, to try and deliver a Sudan-based solution rather than one that is being driven by external forces who have other interests than the welfare of perhaps of the people of Sudan?
Well, let me say from the outset, having gone to the Ardri crossing and up to the border in Chad, the scenes that I witnessed were heartbreaking. The pain and suffering of millions of women and children should offend the entire planet. And it has staggered me, frankly. I think I was asked a question about what I had or had not expected in this role. It has staggered me, the indifference and the lack of outrage at the catastrophe that is the crisis in Sudan at this time. And so one of the reasons that I had the conference and the convening here in London was, of course, to achieve greater pledging and money for the people of Sudan, and we achieved that with 800 million committed, which is hugely important, given I can't say that the war will come to an end in the coming weeks. Two, to bring all of those who have a stake in this crisis around the table and into the room, and we were able to issue a chair's statement. And if you read that statement, it was a good piece of work, drafted, of course, by tireless officials, and I must thank the whole team that were working on this in the department for their huge endeavour over many months to land this conference. And of course it put a spotlight back on this issue nationally and internationally, which was precisely what I wanted to do. As you know, a few months back I put down a resolution in the United Nations. Unbelievably, Russia blocked the resolution. Russia, who claims to stand with African nations and be this great voice for the global South, committed to even more suffering in Sudan. I hope that they will think again. There's a lot of diplomatic effort going in to try and get the Russians to think again. And we will continue to work with partner countries and specifically to bolster and work with the African Union, because we have got to have Africa-led approaches to Africa's conflicts supported by the international community, but alongside the African Union. And all of that effort will go in over the coming months.
Thank you. My question is about Colombia. So I'm taking you to a different part of the world now, which generally gets much less attention than it deserves, despite the excellent work of the UK as penholder for the peace accord at the Security Council. And I was very pleased to see only earlier this month in the report to the Security Council that you emphasise the UK's full support for the UN mission of verification for the peace accord. But as you'll know, this mission requires the annual renewal agreement from all members of the Security Council, or at least no one voting against. And as the current mandate expires in October, it's not clear at the moment what the US's position might be on renewal, and it would be disastrous, of course, if it decided to vote against. So I'd be very interested to know, Foreign Secretary, what your assessment is of that situation, and also your assessment of the prospects of resuming the peace talks with the ELN, which broke down in January. Can the UK use its vantage point as penholder to encourage and help achieve the resumption of these peace talks, which are obviously absolutely vital for any progress of President Petro's Total Peace Initiative?
Well, we certainly welcome the Colombian government's commitment to its implementation and the 2016 peace agreement. I met with the Colombian foreign minister in my office a few months ago. I saw him again. I think it was at the G20, or it might have been in New York. I hope to get to Colombia soon. I haven't discussed this issue with Secretary of State Rubio, but now that you've raised it, I will, given I speak to him on a pretty regular basis. And we have discussed. He takes a great interest, of course, in South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We've discussed, obviously, the very concerning situation in Haiti and the situation in Venezuela. But we haven't discussed Colombia, so I'm very happy to raise that with him.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Crawley.
Thank you, Chair. Given the uncertain times we live in, I mean, I'm assuming that we'll be still talking about President Trump and not Pope Trump in a few weeks' time. But we do live in extremely uncertain times. And I wondered what you were doing in-house to review the way the FCDO is working, how the departments are bringing forward plans within the context of this new diplomatic world that we live in.
Well, I'm going to bring the Perm Sec in here because I saw that David Cameron was so mean he didn't allow Philip Barton to get a word in edgeways last time, and I'm determined not to follow that path. But let me set the vision and then ask the Perm Sec to talk a bit about the how, because this is really important. I am the first Foreign Secretary since William Hague to have shadowed the role in opposition for 3 years, and to be able to come to my own assessment and obviously to speak to lots of people about where we needed to do better. There are thematic issues that have been important for me to set in the right place in the department. So I think we've got to do better on growth. We've got to be the international delivery arm of the government on growth and economic diplomacy. We have a huge role to play on migration, on returns, but alongside the Home Office, on the upstream work in countries. And so I'm really pleased that we've set up a joint unit working alongside the Home Office on that issue. There's more to do on illicit finance, and we have to meet our climate commitments and continue to lead in the world. And with COP coming up in Brazil, I think you'll see a lot more of that with the UK standing alongside our Brazilian partners. So there's important thematic work that we have to do. But I also felt when I came into the department that we weren't embracing technology enough. The AI revolution is happening before our eyes. There's much more we can do to free up diplomats, to do more, perhaps less in Whitehall, more overseas in the coming years. The department felt a bit top heavy, and I'd asked the Perm Sec to look at that issue. I set up 3 reviews that looked at development, that looked at economic diplomacy, our relations with middle powers, also, and the result of those reviews with a new Perm Sec, and I think we got the best, one of the best people in the system, if you like, who's been in Whitehall. It's always embarrassing when someone, but in Whitehall, working in very senior roles, but also not completely of the system in terms of not being a diplomat, but someone who could hold their own in Whitehall, because there was also a sense that the Foreign Office wasn't, as a big department of state, had lost its ebb. So that was what I found in terms of the vision of what I wanted to achieve, and the Perm Sec's absolutely in the weeds of how we're now going to do it.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Given the time, I'll be brief, Chair, but thank you for the opportunity. And I should say, before I say anything about the department, it's an absolute pleasure to be in it. And as you've been hearing for a while now as a committee, the work of the department is extraordinary. And so it's a real privilege to come and try and lead my civil service colleagues who are doing extraordinary things in very tough places often. But as the Foreign Secretary says, you can't expect to win if you're standing still. And so what we're thinking about at the moment is, given that the department now has 6 clear priorities, the Foreign Secretary's just laid them out, from growth to development via security in Europe and climate and development. We've got to work out how we change the department so that by 2030, in what is likely, we're in the middle of a spending review, but what is likely to be a tough spending environment, we're able to look our colleagues in the eye and say we think the jobs that result from this process will be better. The effect that we can produce for the government and its objectives will be better at the end of that process than now. So the 5 things we're focused on, I'll be brief, but are first of all how we prioritise as a department, and I think that's come up in questioning already in this session, how we make sure that we are strategic enough to be able to focus on the things that really make a difference and really project the government's impact and influence in the world. There is an understandable tendency to want to have something on everything, and that may be a luxury we can't quite afford over the coming period. We need to think very carefully about how we chase delivery through the system. So making sure that when we set out our position, when we agree our plans with the Foreign Secretary and with senior colleagues, we're following through. And then we're adjusting. If we're not achieving the things that ministers are asking of us, make sure we know that, and we're able then to tweak the plan to get to a better result. There's a big agenda here about openness. The Foreign Office is extremely good, I think, at picking up on what's going on in the world. It's its core business in many ways. But sometimes it doesn't listen quite as carefully to people here in the United Kingdom. There is an extraordinarily rich culture of both learned commentary on foreign affairs, which obviously this committee benefits from, but also we are lucky enough in this country to have diaspora communities from almost every corner of the world. And we both want the Foreign Office to take a advantage of that ecosystem to make sure that we're employing every single asset the UK has openly to challenge our own policy making and make sure it's the very best it can be. Fourthly, we've touched on workforce. As I say, the material we have in the department is absolutely first rate, I'm delighted to find, but sometimes we hold it back. We haven't, this has been implied in one or two of the questions already today. We could do more to invest in the capability of our own workforce, whether it be in supporting the development of genuine Chinese and Mandarin expertise, or supporting that workforce in some of the most difficult to place workplaces in the world. There's a lot to do. And the Foreign Secretary announced in opposition, I think, a College of British Diplomacy, which will be our vehicle for really concentrating on the skills and development and talent that we've got in the department. And then finally, an important, if slightly dull-sounding word, efficiency. I come into the department, and of course, for good reasons, by decent people, processes have multiplied, and there is a job of work to be done just to streamline and to make sure, as the Foreign Secretary says, that we're taking advantage of the very best techniques and technology to give our people, often in tough jobs, the best tools we can. So those are the 5 things we're focused on as a leadership team, Foreign Secretary holding us to account. We get the spending review outcome hopefully now in a matter of weeks, and then we'll know exactly what we're delivering against for the next few years.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. I think Baroness Blackstone wants to follow up.
Yes, a quick one.
But very briefly, many years ago I was involved in a huge study of our overrepresentation, overseas representation, and how we made foreign policy in London and around the world. And certainly the Foreign Office was then hugely top-heavy. So it's interesting that you've discovered, or think that it may be still. And I don't know whether the Permanent Secretary will agree, but the more top-heavy you are, the more you deny opportunities for your very able, younger and more junior people. And it's deeply frustrating for them. So I do hope you're able to address this one. But the second thing is that I've recently been overseas, and one of the criticisms that have been made of the Foreign Office in London is how immensely slow it is at making decisions, particularly about the allocation of funds for overseas development. So speed, I think, is of the essence to be more efficient. So that's a bit of feedback for you. You may have had it already.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I respond very briefly to the first point there? Just to say we're that all of the questions that the Foreign Secretary has been asked this afternoon also do point to the need for good experience and judgment. And so, there is a careful balance to strike here, given we operate a rotational model of getting people out overseas about not slimming down too far at the top. But I am very alive to the risk that if you have too many senior people, the work drifts upwards, and you don't give younger diplomats and development officers the chance they need.
Foreign Secretary, Number 10 announced earlier this month that the UK is finalising a deal with Mauritius on Chagos. Can you provide the committee with timelines for signature and when Parliament may have sight of the text of the treaty? And will it require primary legislation and or the CRAG procedure?
Well, I want to be absolutely clear that it absolutely will get the full scrutiny that you would expect it to get when those discussions come to a fruition. I can't give a timeline because these are detailed discussions, and at the heart of this, despite some of the noise that we've seen off, is national security. Is UK national security, is securing a base for the next century, and a base on Diego Garcia that keeps much of the global community safe at a time when there are immense challenges globally and specifically in the Indo-Pacific. And that is a base that has served us so well. It's in so many ways, and actually was active in relation to the Red Sea just over this last period. So I absolutely undertake that when we get there, I would expect proper parliamentary scrutiny and debate and discussion as you would expect.
Thank you. We've got time for Baroness.
Absolutely.
One more.
Final question.
Not in relation to Chagos, but going back to something that both of you have mentioned in different answers, which is the importance of Mandarin expertise. You've both mentioned that. I just want to be sure that you're aware that currently the Department for Education is considering whether it should renew funding for the extraordinarily successful Mandarin Excellence Programme, whose funding expires in August this year. And you clearly understand the importance of producing a pipeline of British nationals who are Mandarin speakers for diplomacy, for security and for business. So I do hope you will make the views of the FCDO and the needs of the FCDO known to the DFE before it makes a decision that would be a very backward-looking decision if the Mandarin Excellence Programme were to be cut.
Let me just say one last thing to the committee that is important. It runs through much of, I hope, my contribution and the outlook of the department. I set it out in opposition, and I think it's stood the test of time. And that is that the posture of the UK has got to be one of progressive realism. We have to meet the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be, with the huge challenges we've got with global war, the huge pressures we've got with competing superpowers, and that means we've got to be fit for purpose for today, not fit for purpose for yesterday or decades ago. And that's what makes Mandarin hugely important to invest in at this time. And I can't emphasize that enough, and of course I emphasize it to my colleagues. And it's why, following my visit to China, I was keen to catalyse Whitehall engaging with China. And because we had been absent for so many years, actually this is not just ministerially, I think there was quite a lot of nervousness amongst officials. How do we engage with China? And so the capability bit, sometimes it involves speaking the language, but also being empowered to engage is fundamentally important. But of course you do it very clear-eyed about the challenges as well. Thank you.
Foreign Secretary, thank you for giving up an hour and a half of your very busy time.
Thank you. I look forward to coming back. Thank you.
Hold you to that.